Because before that, every country had its own rules. If you came here show jumping, you jumped under British rules. If you went to France, you went under French rules and Germany. So when they introduced the Olympic Games, they said, well, you've got to have the same rules for everybody.
You won't believe what this woman discovered when she took a DNA test. What started as innocent curiosity about her dark hair turned into the most shocking family secret you've ever heard.
For various reasons, if you remember, there was the Festival of Britain, and I got to know various people there who'd done things for it, and you look to see the new generation of design of all sorts.
Royal Spanish blood? Check. Viking warriors? Absolutely. But when scientists dug deeper, they uncovered a criminal ancestor so disturbing that her family had completely erased her from history. DNA testing has revolutionized how we understand our ancestry. What once required years of genealogical research can now be revealed through a simple saliva sample. The science behind genetic testing analyzes specific markers in our DNA that can trace our lineage back thousands of years, connecting us to populations and regions our ancestors called home. These genetic markers act like breadcrumbs, leading us back through time to uncover the truth about where we really came from. Meet Sarah, a marketing professional from Auckland, whose family story mirrors that of many New Zealanders. Like countless others with European heritage, she grew up hearing fragments of family history that seemed almost too interesting to be true. Her grandmother used to joke about having Spanish royal blood, claiming their family descended from a princess who had fled Spain centuries ago. It was the kind of story that got repeated at family gatherings, always with a smile and a shrug, as if no one quite believed it, but everyone enjoyed the romance of the idea. Sarah had always been curious about these family tales, particularly because of her appearance. While most of her relatives had the fair skin and light hair typical of their known Celtic ancestry, Sarah stood out with her darker complexion, deep brown eyes, and nearly black hair. Family members often commented on how different she looked, sparking conversations about where these features might have come from. Was there truth to the Spanish princess story? Could there be other explanations for her distinctive appearance? The questions became more pressing as Sarah got older. In a world where ancestry and heritage play important roles in personal identity, she wanted to know the real story behind her family's past. The rise of consumer DNA testing offered an opportunity to finally get some answers. For less than the cost of a weekend getaway, she could unlock secrets that had been hidden in her genetic code for generations. The process itself was surprisingly simple. Sarah ordered a testing kit online, provided a saliva sample, and mailed it back to the laboratory. Within a few weeks, she received an email notification that her results were ready. What she discovered would challenge everything she thought she knew about her family's history. The initial results confirmed what Sarah expected to find. Her DNA showed strong Celtic markers, indicating significant Welsh and Scottish ancestry. This aligned perfectly with her family's known history and the stories she had grown up hearing about ancestors from the British Isles. The Celtic connection explained much of her family's documented genealogy and provided a scientific foundation for the oral traditions that had been passed down through the generations. However, the results also contained surprises that would reshape Sarah's understanding of her heritage. Alongside the expected Celtic markers, her genetic profile revealed substantial Southern European ancestry. The laboratory's analysis indicated possible connections to Spain and Portugal, lending unexpected credibility to her grandmother's tales of Spanish royalty. While the DNA couldn't confirm the specific story of a Spanish princess, it did provide evidence that Sarah's ancestors had indeed spent significant time in the Iberian Peninsula. This discovery raised fascinating questions about her family's migration patterns. How had her Spanish ancestors ended up in the British Isles? Had they arrived as part of larger historical movements of people? Or were they individual travelers who had made the journey for personal reasons? The genetic evidence suggested that this Southern European influence was substantial enough to have lasted through multiple generations, indicating it wasn't just a single ancestor, but possibly a whole branch of the family tree. The surprises didn't end with the Spanish connection. As Sarah delved deeper into her results, she discovered something that completely blindsided her and her family. her DNA contained markers indicating East Asian ancestry. This revelation came as a complete shock, as no family stories or documented genealogy had ever hinted at connections to Asia. The presence of these genetic markers suggested that somewhere in her lineage, probably several generations back, there had been ancestors from East Asia. This discovery highlighted one of the most fascinating aspects of DNA testing. While families often preserve stories about recent ancestors or particularly notable figures, much of our genetic history remains hidden. The movement of people throughout history, whether through trade, migration, or other circumstances, has created genetic connections that span continents and cultures. Sarah's East Asian ancestry could have resulted from any number of historical scenarios, from ancient trade routes that connected Europe and Asia to more recent family connections that had simply been forgotten over time. The East Asian markers in Sarah's DNA also demonstrated how interconnected human populations have always been. Long before modern transportation made global travel commonplace, people were moving across continents, forming relationships, and creating the complex genetic tapestry that shows up in contemporary DNA tests. These connections remind us that our ancestors' lives were often far more diverse and complicated than the simplified family stories that get passed down through generations. As Sarah processed these unexpected results, she began to understand that her family's history was far more complex than anyone had imagined. The Spanish princess story, while possibly exaggerated, had clearly been rooted in some genetic truth. The East Asian ancestry added an entirely new dimension to her heritage that would require further investigation to understand. Most importantly, the results showed that genetic ancestry rarely follows the neat, linear patterns that family stories suggest. The DNA analysis also revealed markers from the Basque region of northern Spain, adding another layer to Sarah's already complex genetic profile. The Basques represent one of Europe's oldest populations, with a unique language and culture that has survived for thousands of years. This connection suggested that Sarah's Spanish ancestry might be even more ancient and culturally significant than her family had ever imagined. These initial results were just the beginning of Sarah's journey into her genetic past. Each marker and connection raised new questions about how her ancestors had lived, where they had traveled, and what circumstances had brought together the diverse genetic influences that now defined her heritage. The DNA test had confirmed that family stories often contain grains of truth, even when the specific details have been embellished or forgotten over time. The experience also highlighted the limitations of what genetic testing can reveal. While DNA can identify geographic regions and population groups in our ancestry, it cannot tell us the personal stories of our ancestors' lives. The test results showed that Sarah had Spanish, Celtic, East Asian, and Basque ancestry, but they couldn't explain how these different groups had come together in her family line, or what individual experiences had shaped her ancestors' decisions to travel and settle in new places. What the DNA results did provide was a roadmap for further exploration. Each genetic marker represented a potential avenue for research, a clue that could lead to a deeper understanding of her family's past. The test had transformed Sarah's vague curiosity about her appearance and family stories into a concrete starting point for investigating her heritage. With these genetic clues in hand, she was ready to begin the next phase of her journey into the past. The discovery of Sarah's diverse genetic background had already challenged her family's understanding of their heritage, but the DNA analysis held even more surprises. As geneticists examined her results more closely, they identified markers that would completely reshape how she thought about her Northern European ancestry. Hidden within her Celtic genetic signature were clear indicators of Scandinavian heritage, specifically markers associated with Viking populations that had spread across Northern Europe more than 1,000 years ago. This revelation came as a significant surprise to Sarah and her family. While they had always known about their Celtic roots, the idea of Viking ancestry had never been part of their family narrative. The Vikings, those legendary seafaring warriors and traders from Scandinavia, had left their genetic mark on populations across Europe, But Sarah's family had no oral traditions or stories that hinted at this connection. The DNA evidence, however, was unmistakable. The presence of Viking genetic markers in Sarah's DNA highlighted an important aspect of how we understand historical populations. When most people think of Vikings, they picture the stereotypical image popularized by movies and television shows: tall, blonde, blue-eyed warriors wearing horned helmets and wielding massive swords. This image has become so deeply embedded in popular culture that it's easy to forget that the Viking world was actually far more diverse than these representations suggest. Archaeological and genetic evidence reveals that Viking populations included people with a wide range of physical characteristics. While many Vikings did come from Scandinavia and possess the fair features we associate with that region, others had darker hair and eyes, reflecting the complex mix of populations that made up the Viking world. The Vikings were not a single ethnic group, but rather a collection of different tribes and communities, each with their own characteristics and traditions. Sarah's dark hair and eyes, which had always made her stand out among her predominantly fair-skinned relatives, suddenly made more sense in this context. The genetic markers in her DNA suggested that her Viking ancestors may have been among those with darker features, challenging the conventional image of what Vikings looked like. This discovery provided a new explanation for her distinctive appearance and connected her to a rich historical tradition that extended far beyond the popular stereotypes. The Viking influence in Sarah's DNA led researchers to investigate specific regions where her ancestors might have lived. One location that emerged as particularly significant was the Isle of Man, a small island located in the Irish Sea between England and Ireland. The Isle of Man has a unique history that perfectly illustrates the complex relationship between Celtic and Viking populations during the medieval period. Vikings first arrived on the Isle of Man around the 9th century, drawn by its strategic location and rich resources. Unlike many other Viking expeditions that focused primarily on raiding and quick departures, the Vikings who settled on the Isle of Man established a lasting presence that would influence the island's culture for centuries. They didn't simply conquer the existing Celtic population. Instead, they integrated with the local communities, creating a distinctive blend of Norse and Celtic traditions. The genetic evidence in Sarah's DNA suggested a possible connection to these Viking settlements on the Isle of Man. This connection prompted a deeper investigation into the island's history and the archaeological evidence that reveals how Vikings and Celts lived together in this unique environment. The Isle of Man became a focal point for understanding how Sarah's ancestors might have experienced the blending of these two distinct cultural traditions. Archaeological discoveries on the Isle of Man have provided fascinating insights into Viking life and burial practices. At Peel Castle, one of the island's most important historical sites, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of Viking settlements and burial grounds that offer a window into how these people lived and died. The castle, which sits on a small island connected to the main landmass by a causeway, served as a stronghold for Viking kings and later medieval rulers. The burial practices revealed at Peel Castle demonstrate the complexity of Viking society and their beliefs about death and the afterlife. In one particularly significant grave dating to the 9th century, archaeologists discovered the remains of a Viking warrior buried alongside a woman, a horse, and several domestic animals. This type of burial, known as a ship burial or boat grave, reflects the Viking belief that the deceased needed to be equipped for their journey to the afterlife. The presence of both human and animal remains in these graves tells us much about Viking society and values. The inclusion of horses and livestock suggests that these animals were considered essential for the afterlife journey, while the burial of men and women together indicates complex social relationships and possibly shared status within Viking communities. These archaeological findings help us understand that Viking society was more nuanced than the simple warrior culture often portrayed in popular media. For Sarah, learning about these burial practices and archaeological discoveries provided a tangible connection to her possible Viking ancestry. Standing at the site where her ancestors might have lived and died more than 1,000 years ago created a powerful sense of connection to the past. the physical evidence of Viking presence on the Isle of Man transformed abstract genetic markers into real historical experiences that her family could relate to and understand. The blending of Celtic and Viking cultures on the Isle of Man also helps explain the complex genetic patterns found in Sarah's DNA. Rather than representing separate, distinct ancestries, her Celtic and Viking markers likely reflect the integrated communities that developed on the island and in similar locations throughout the British Isles. The Vikings who settled in these areas didn't remain isolated from local populations. They formed relationships, intermarried, and created new cultural traditions that combined elements from both backgrounds. This cultural integration extended beyond the Isle of Man to other regions where Vikings established long-term settlements. In Scotland, Ireland, and Northern England, archaeological evidence shows similar patterns of Viking and Celtic communities living together and influencing each other's traditions. The genetic legacy of these interactions can still be seen in modern populations throughout these regions, with many people carrying markers from both ancestral groups. The discovery of Viking ancestry in Sarah's DNA also highlighted the importance of understanding migration patterns in European history. The Vikings were not just raiders who appeared suddenly and disappeared. They were part of larger population movements that reshaped the genetic and cultural landscape of Europe. Their travels took them from their Scandinavian homelands to settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, while also establishing communities throughout the British Isles and along European coastlines. These migration patterns help explain how genetic markers associated with Viking populations ended up in families like Sarah's, whose recent genealogical records showed no obvious Scandinavian connections. The Vikings' extensive travels and tendency to settle in distant locations created genetic connections that span vast geographic areas and many centuries. Sarah's Viking ancestry could have originated from settlements anywhere within this extensive network of Viking communities. The revelation of Viking heritage also provided new context for understanding Sarah's family's historical experiences. The Vikings were known not just as warriors, but as traders, explorers, and settlers who helped establish many of the trade routes and cultural connections that shaped medieval Europe. They were skilled craftspeople, innovative shipbuilders, and sophisticated navigators who contributed significantly to the development of European civilization. Understanding this broader context of Viking contributions to European history helped Sarah appreciate that her Viking ancestry represented more than just a genetic curiosity. It connected her to a tradition of exploration, cultural exchange, and adaptation that had played a crucial role in shaping the modern world. The Vikings' willingness to travel to distant lands, establish new communities, and integrate with local populations reflected qualities that continued to influence their descendants for generations. The genetic evidence of Viking ancestry also raised intriguing questions about what other surprises might be hidden in Sarah's DNA. If the testing had revealed unexpected connections to Scandinavian populations, what other ancestral relationships might be waiting to be discovered? The Viking markers represented just one piece of a much larger genetic puzzle that would continue to unfold as the analysis progressed. As Sarah absorbed the implications of her Viking heritage, she began to understand that genetic ancestry is rarely straightforward or predictable. The discovery challenged her assumptions about her family's past and demonstrated how much history can be hidden within our genetic code. The Viking connection provided a new lens through which to view her heritage and opened up entirely new avenues for exploration and understanding. While Sarah's Viking ancestry had already expanded her understanding of her genetic heritage, the DNA analysis continued to reveal connections that stretched far beyond Northern Europe. The laboratory's detailed examination of her genetic markers uncovered evidence of Mediterranean ancestry that would add yet another dimension to her already complex family history. These Southern European connections appeared to be substantial enough to suggest significant ancestral ties to the ancient cultures that had flourished around the Mediterranean Sea for thousands of years. The Mediterranean region has served as one of humanity's great crossroads throughout history. Its strategic location between Europe, Africa, and Asia made it a natural meeting point for different civilizations, cultures, and peoples. Over millennia, countless groups have traveled across these waters, establishing trade routes, founding colonies, and creating the complex web of genetic and cultural connections that characterizes the region today. For Sarah, discovering that her ancestry included Mediterranean roots meant connecting to this rich tapestry of human history and migration. The genetic markers pointing to Mediterranean ancestry appeared to be particularly strong in regions associated with Italy and the surrounding islands. Laboratory analysis suggested possible connections to populations from the Italian peninsula, but one location stood out as especially significant: the island of Sardinia. This large island, located west of the Italian mainland in the heart of the Mediterranean, has long fascinated geneticists and anthropologists due to its unique population characteristics and genetic isolation. Sardinia represents something of a genetic time capsule. Due to its island location and relatively limited contact with outside populations throughout much of its history, the Sardinian people have maintained genetic characteristics that provide insights into ancient Mediterranean populations. Studies of Sardinian genetics have revealed that the island's inhabitants carry genetic markers that can be traced back thousands of years, offering a window into the deep ancestry of Mediterranean peoples. Perhaps most remarkably, Sardinia is famous for having one of the highest concentrations of centenarians in the world. The island's population includes an unusually large number of people who live to be 100 years old or more, a phenomenon that has attracted significant scientific attention. Researchers have studied Sardinian genetics extensively to understand whether genetic factors contribute to this exceptional longevity, and their findings suggest that the island's unique genetic heritage may indeed play a role in the health and lifespan of its inhabitants. The possibility that Sarah's ancestors had connections to Sardinia raised intriguing questions about what genetic traits she might have inherited from this remarkable population. While genetic predisposition to longevity is complex and influenced by many factors beyond ancestry, the connection to Sardinian genetics added an interesting dimension to her family's health history. It also provided a concrete link to one of the Mediterranean's most distinctive and well-studied populations. Sardinia's strategic location in the Mediterranean meant that its history was shaped by interactions with many different civilizations. Over the centuries, the island was influenced by Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Romans, Byzantines, and various other groups that established presences there. Each of these civilizations left cultural and genetic traces that contributed to the island's unique character. The Romans, in particular, had a significant impact on Sardinian society, establishing settlements and infrastructure that influenced the island's development for centuries. The genetic evidence of Sarah's Mediterranean ancestry extended beyond just Italian connections. The analysis revealed markers suggesting ties to other parts of southern Europe, including Spain and possibly North Africa. This broader Mediterranean genetic signature reflected the interconnected nature of ancient civilizations around the sea. The Phoenicians, for example, established trading networks that connected Spain, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean, facilitating the movement of people and ideas across vast distances. These Mediterranean connections helped explain some of the Spanish ancestry that had appeared in Sarah's initial DNA results. Rather than representing a single line of Spanish heritage, her genetic markers likely reflected the complex history of population movements throughout the Mediterranean region. The ancient world was characterized by extensive trade networks, military campaigns, and population migrations that created genetic connections spanning the entire Mediterranean basin. While exploring her Mediterranean heritage, Sarah's genetic analysis also revealed strong markers associated with Celtic populations. This discovery provided scientific confirmation of her family's long-held beliefs about their Celtic ancestry, but it also opened up new avenues for understanding the extent and nature of these connections. The Celtic peoples had once spread across much of Europe, from Ireland and Scotland in the west to parts of modern-day Turkey in the east, creating one of the continent's most extensive cultural and genetic networks. Celtic genetic markers in Sarah's DNA suggested connections to multiple regions where Celtic populations had thrived. The analysis pointed to possible ancestry from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and parts of continental Europe, where Celtic tribes had established significant presences. This widespread Celtic influence reflected the historical reality that Celtic peoples had been among Europe's most successful and far-reaching cultural groups before the expansion of Roman power. The Celtic connection took on particular significance when considered alongside Sarah's other ancestral discoveries. The Celts had extensive interactions with Mediterranean civilizations, particularly through trade and, later, through the Roman conquest of Celtic territories. These historical connections meant that Sarah's Celtic and Mediterranean ancestry might not represent completely separate genetic lineages, but could instead reflect the complex interactions between these populations over many centuries. Archaeological evidence shows that Celtic societies maintained sophisticated trade relationships with Mediterranean civilizations, long before Roman expansion brought direct political control to Celtic territories. Celtic metalwork, artwork, and other cultural products found their way to Mediterranean markets, while Mediterranean goods, ideas, and people traveled north to Celtic lands. These exchanges created opportunities for genetic mixing that could explain some of the complex ancestry patterns visible in modern DNA analyses. The spiritual and cultural traditions of Celtic peoples also provided context for understanding Sarah's connection to these ancestral populations. Celtic societies were known for their deep reverence for nature, their sophisticated artistic traditions, and their complex spiritual beliefs that emphasize the interconnectedness of all living things. Celtic monuments and archaeological sites throughout Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and other regions demonstrate the sophistication of these ancient cultures and their lasting influence on European civilization. Standing stones, ancient burial sites, and other Celtic monuments scattered across the landscape provide tangible connections to these ancestral populations. For people like Sarah, who discover Celtic ancestry through DNA testing, these sites offer opportunities to connect physically with the places their ancestors knew and the landscapes that shaped their lives. The enduring presence of Celtic cultural traditions in modern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales also provides living connections to ancestral ways of life. The combination of Celtic, Mediterranean, and Viking ancestry, revealed through Sarah's DNA analysis, demonstrated the fundamentally interconnected nature of European population history. Rather than representing distinct, separate lineages, these different ancestral components reflected the complex web of relationships, migrations, and cultural exchanges that had shaped European civilization over thousands of years. Sarah's genetic heritage was not just a collection of individual ancestry components, but a reflection of the broader patterns of human movement and interaction that characterized ancient and medieval Europe. This realization helped Sarah understand that her ancestry was part of a much larger human story. The genetic markers in her DNA represented not just individual family lines, but the collective experiences of countless ancestors who had participated in the Great Migrations, cultural exchanges, and historical events that shaped European history. Her heritage connected her to traders who had sailed across the Mediterranean, Celtic warriors who had defended their territories against Roman expansion, Vikings who had explored distant lands, and countless other individuals whose lives had contributed to the complex genetic legacy she carried. The Mediterranean and Celtic connections in Sarah's ancestry also highlighted the limitations of trying to understand genetic heritage through modern national boundaries. Her ancestors had lived in a world where the political maps looked completely different from today, where cultural and genetic boundaries rarely corresponded to the borders of modern countries. The ancient Mediterranean was a unified cultural and economic zone that facilitated movement and interaction across what are now many different nations. Understanding this broader historical context helped Sarah appreciate that her genetic heritage represented something far more complex and interesting than simple national or ethnic categories. Her DNA carried the legacy of ancient civilizations, extensive trade networks, cultural exchanges, and human migrations that had shaped the development of European civilization. Each genetic marker represented a thread in the vast tapestry of human history, connecting her to the experiences and achievements of countless ancestors whose lives had contributed to the world she inhabited today. As Sarah reflected on these discoveries, she began to see her genetic heritage not just as a personal curiosity, but as a window into the broader patterns of human history and migration. Her ancestry provided insights into how ancient populations had moved, interacted, and influenced each other across vast distances and time periods. The Celtic, Mediterranean, and Viking components of her heritage represented different chapters in the long story of human civilization, each contributing to the complex genetic and cultural legacy that defined her identity in the modern world. As Sarah's genetic journey continued to unfold, she discovered that DNA testing could reveal more than just geographic origins and ancient cultural connections. The same technology that had uncovered her Viking, Celtic, and Mediterranean heritage could also connect her to specific individuals in her family tree, some of whom carried stories that her family had never shared. Through genetic matching services that compare DNA profiles across databases, Sarah was connected to distant relatives who possessed detailed genealogical records that would fundamentally change her understanding of her family's past. One particular connection led Sarah to discover documentation about her great-great-great-grandmother, a woman named Margaret, whose story had been completely absent from the family narratives Sarah had grown up hearing. The records revealed that Margaret had lived in early 19th century Britain during a period of significant social upheaval and economic hardship. What Sarah learned about Margaret's life would challenge her assumptions about her family's respectability and force her to confront the reality that family histories often conceal as much as they reveal. Margaret's story emerged through a combination of court records, transportation documents, and prison registers that had been preserved in British archives. These official documents painted a picture of a young woman whose life had taken a tragic turn that resulted in her being sentenced to transportation to the penal colony of Tasmania. The crime for which Margaret was convicted was one that carried severe social stigma in 19th century British society, a transgression that would have marked her and her family with lasting shame. The historical records indicated that Margaret had been found guilty of engaging in an inappropriate relationship with a close family member. Such cases, while not uncommon in the historical record, carried enormous social consequences during this period. The British legal system of the early 1800s dealt harshly with what it considered moral crimes, and Margaret's conviction resulted in a sentence that would remove her permanently from British society. She was among the thousands of convicts transported to the Australian colonies as part of the British Empire's system of penal transportation. Understanding Margaret's fate required examining the broader historical context of British penal transportation. Between 1788 and 1868, approximately 160,000 convicts were transported from Britain to Australian colonies, with Tasmania receiving a significant portion of these prisoners. The transportation system served multiple purposes for British authorities. It removed criminals from British society, provided labor for colonial development, and was considered a more humane alternative to execution or long-term imprisonment in overcrowded British prisons. For convicts like Margaret, transportation represented both punishment and opportunity. While the journey to Tasmania was harsh, and the initial years of colonial life were marked by strict supervision and forced labor, many transported convicts eventually gained their freedom and established new lives in the colonies. The Australian colonies offered possibilities for social reinvention that would have been impossible in Britain, where criminal records and social stigma followed individuals throughout their lives. Margaret's story illustrates the complex social dynamics that shaped 19th century British society. The crime for which she was convicted reflected the strict moral codes and legal frameworks that governed family relationships during this period. British society placed enormous emphasis on maintaining proper family structures and moral behavior, with severe consequences for those who violated these expectations. Women, in particular, faced harsh judgment for any behavior that was seen as threatening to social order or family stability. The transportation system also reflected broader attitudes about class, gender, and social control. Many of those transported to the Australian colonies came from Britain's poorest communities, where overcrowding, economic hardship, and limited opportunities created conditions that sometimes led to desperate choices. Women convicted of moral crimes often faced particularly harsh treatment, as their behavior was seen as especially threatening to social stability. For Margaret, the journey to Tasmania marked the beginning of a completely new life. Historical records suggest that she eventually married and had children in the colony, becoming part of the growing population of former convicts who helped establish Australian society. Her descendants would have grown up in a very different world from the one she had left behind in Britain, with opportunities and social dynamics that were shaped by the unique conditions of colonial life. The discovery of Margaret's story had profound implications for Sarah's understanding of her family's history. The complete absence of any family memory or oral tradition regarding Margaret suggested that her story had been deliberately erased from the family narrative. This erasure likely reflected the shame and stigma associated with having a transported convict in the family tree, particularly one convicted of a moral crime that would have been considered especially scandalous. The process of family forgetting is not uncommon in genealogical research. Families often choose to emphasize certain aspects of their history while suppressing others, creating selective narratives that present their heritage in the most favorable light possible. Stories of respectability, achievement, and social standing are preserved and retold, while accounts of crime, scandal, or social disgrace are allowed to fade from memory. Over several generations, these omissions can result in complete gaps in family knowledge. Margaret's erasure from family memory also reflected broader social attitudes about women and moral behavior. In 19th and early 20th century society, the reputation of family women was considered crucial to the family's social standing. Having an ancestor who had been convicted of a moral crime and transported as a convict would have been seen as a source of lasting shame that could affect the family's prospects for generations. The decision to suppress Margaret's story was likely motivated by a desire to protect the family's reputation and social standing. The rediscovery of Margaret's story through DNA research highlighted both the power and the responsibility that comes with genetic genealogy. While DNA testing can uncover long-lost family connections and forgotten histories, it can also reveal information that families had deliberately chosen to conceal. For Sarah, learning about Margaret's fate raised complex questions about how to respond to this newly discovered family history. Understanding Margaret's story also required Sarah to consider the historical context that had shaped her ancestors' choices and circumstances. The early 19th century was a period of significant social and economic change in Britain, with industrialization, urbanization, and population growth creating new pressures on traditional family structures. Many people, particularly those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, faced difficult circumstances that limited their options and sometimes led to tragic outcomes. Margaret's conviction and transportation also reflected the harsh realities of the British legal system during this period. The justice system of the early 1800s was characterized by severe punishments for a wide range of crimes, with limited consideration for individual circumstances or social factors that might have contributed to criminal behavior. The transportation system, while considered progressive compared to execution or long-term imprisonment, still represented a form of exile that permanently separated convicts from their families and communities. For Sarah, grappling with Margaret's story meant confronting the reality that family history includes both triumph and tragedy, respectability and scandal, heroism and human frailty. Margaret's life represented a reminder that the past is complex, and that the people who came before us faced challenges and made choices that we might struggle to understand or accept. Her story was not one of nobility or achievement, but of human weakness, poor judgment, and the harsh consequences that followed. The discovery also raised questions about the nature of family identity and how much our ancestors' actions should influence our understanding of ourselves. Margaret's crime and punishment had occurred more than 150 years before Sarah's birth, across multiple generations of family history. Yet the genetic connection remained, creating a direct link between Sarah and this difficult chapter of her family's past. As Sarah processed the implications of Margaret's story, she began to understand that acknowledging difficult family history was an important part of developing a complete understanding of her heritage. While it would have been easier to focus only on the more appealing aspects of her ancestry, such as her connections to ancient Celtic cultures or Mediterranean civilizations, the full truth of her family's past included both light and darkness. Margaret's story also served as a reminder of the importance of historical context in understanding our ancestors' lives. The choices and circumstances that led to Margaret's conviction occurred within a specific social, economic, and legal framework that was very different from the modern world. Understanding her story required Sarah to educate herself about 19th century British society and the forces that shaped people's lives during that period. The rediscovery of Margaret's story through genetic genealogy also highlighted the ongoing evolution of how families understand and preserve their histories. While previous generations had chosen to suppress Margaret's story, modern DNA technology had made it impossible to maintain this silence. Sarah's generation would need to decide how to integrate this difficult knowledge into their family narrative and whether to pass Margaret's story on to future generations. In the end, Margaret's story became an integral part of Sarah's understanding of her genetic heritage. While it was painful to learn about this family tragedy, it also provided a more complete and honest picture of her ancestry. The discovery reminded Sarah that genetic heritage encompasses the full range of human experience, and that understanding our past requires accepting both the achievements and the failures of those who came before us.